For over a century, scientists believed they understood what happened at Tunguska. A meteor exploded in the sky, flattening 2,000 square kilometers of Siberian forest. But when Dr. Ben Carter pushed his ground-penetrating radar beyond its limits, searching for fragments that should have been there, he found something impossible instead. Not debris from space, but a half-mile-long craft buried in the permafrost. The explosion hadn't come from above. It had detonated from the ground up, and after lying dormant for over 100 years, it was waking up. The rotor wash of the Mi-8 helicopter was a violent, percussive roar against the profound silence of the Siberian taiga. Below, a ghost forest stretched to every horizon, a pale, monochromatic sea of dead trees. 2,000 square kilometers of timber, flattened in a single instant over a century ago. From this height, the blast pattern was terrifyingly clear, a radial burst of destruction frozen in time. Inside the rattling cabin, Dr. Ben Carter was oblivious to the noise. His world was compressed to the glowing screen of his tablet, a map of their flight path overlaid with complex atmospheric and geological data. He was a man of sharp angles and sharper focus, his expedition gear as precise and cutting edge as his thinking. He pointed to a spot on the map, raising his voice over the engine. The consensus holds that the object, likely a stony asteroid, between 50 and 100 meters in diameter, entered the atmosphere at a shallow angle, he lectured, his tone carrying the easy confidence of a man who has rehearsed his facts 1,000 times. It never struck the ground. Instead, it detonated at an altitude of approximately 8 kilometers. The thermal radiation incinerated the trees directly below, and the subsequent shockwave flattened everything else. The pilot, a grizzled Evenki man named Yuri with eyes that had seen 60 unforgiving winters, grunted without looking away from the controls. "My grandfather saw it," he said, his voice a low rumble. He was a boy, with the reindeer herds north of the Vanavara. He said it was a fire in the sky that wasn't thunder. He said the sky split open and a second sun was born, one that burned with cold fire. Carter offered a tight, professional smile. Eyewitness accounts from the time are invaluable, of course, but trauma and folklore can color perception. The physics, however, are unambiguous. An airburst is the only model that fits the evidence. He turned his gaze back to the window, to the endless expanse of fallen trees. To Carter, this was not a place of myth or legend. It was simply the world's largest, most fascinating impact site, a problem to be measured, mapped, and definitively solved. The final piece of the puzzle, the buried fragments of the object itself, awaited him below, and with the technology he brought, finding it was an inevitability. The helicopter set down in a small, pre-selected clearing, its rotors whipping up a frenzy of pine needles and dust before falling into a deep, echoing silence. The wilderness reasserted itself instantly. This was a place that had swallowed expeditions whole, a land of bogs, swarms of insects, and profound, unnerving quiet. For Carter, it was simply a laboratory. He worked with a quiet, single-minded efficiency that bordered on the robotic. This was a one-man operation by design. Fewer variables, less room for error. One by one, he unloaded heavy black Pelican cases from the helicopter's hold, arranging them in a neat, geometric grid on the mossy ground. Each case was labeled in stark white lettering: spectrometer, core drill, satellite comms, GPR array. This was the arsenal of reason, a collection of instruments designed to banish all ambiguity. Over the next few hours, he assembled his habitat. A geodesic dome rose from the forest floor, its white hexagonal panels a stark, alien structure against the dark greens and browns of the taiga. He unfurled solar arrays, their black glass drinking in the pale sun. An antenna mast was erected, pointing skyward, a silent promise of connection to the civilized world. When he was finished, Carter stood back and surveyed his work. A perfect, sterile bubble of order imposed upon a landscape of primal chaos. Here, in his command tent, the world would behave as it should. The laws of physics were constant. The data would tell its story, and that story, he was certain, would be about a rock falling from the sky. The next day, the real work began. Carter moved across the uneven, boggy ground, pushing the ground-penetrating radar array before him. The machine was a sleek sled-like device, and he guided it in a precise grid pattern he had programmed the night before. His movements were steady, rhythmic, his eyes locked on the tablet mounted to the GPRS handle. The screen displayed the data feed in real time, a cross-section of the Earth scrolling past. He knew what he was looking for. He had simulated it countless times. Below the topsoil and the permafrost, he expected to see a chaotic scattering of high-density signatures, the telltale digital fingerprint of meteoric iron and iridium, blasted into the ground by the force of the explosion. It would be messy, distributed, but it would be there. But it wasn't. The data streaming onto his screen was flat, impossibly, unnaturally clean. Layer of topsoil, layer of peat, layer of permafrost, all clear, distinct, and undisturbed. There was no chaotic debris field, no mineral scattering, nothing. Carter stopped. He checked the GPRS connections, then tapped through the diagnostic menus on his tablet. Everything was optimal. He sighed. A small puff of condensation in the cool air, a localized pocket of magnetic interference perhaps, or a software glitch in the initial rendering. He ran a full system recalibration, the machine humming obediently. The process took 10 minutes. Then he started again, pushing the array over the same patch of ground. He watched the screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. The result was identical. A perfect, clean, empty slice of the Earth. He walked another 50 meters, turned, and scanned a new transect. The same, then another and another. An hour passed. The data never changed. It was all wrong. The evidence that was supposed to be here, the very foundation of the accepted scientific model, was completely, inexplicably absent. For the first time since his arrival, a flicker of profound doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through Dr. Ben Carter's wall of certainty. He stood alone in the vast Siberian wilderness, staring at data that told him the one thing he wasn't prepared to hear. The theory was wrong. Doubt is a corrosive agent. For a man like Ben Carter, a man whose entire professional life was built upon the bedrock of certainty, it was an unfamiliar poison. The clean, empty data from his first day of surveys had planted a seed of it in his mind, and in the long cold hours of the Siberian night, that seed began to sprout. His research tent, a bastion of order just days ago, had transformed into the chaotic den of an obsessive. The air was cold and stale. Multiple monitors cast a pale, sterile glow on his haggard face. Topographical maps were pinned to the fabric walls, cross-hatched with his own frantic notations. He had unearthed his digital copies of Leonid Kulik's expedition notes from the 1920s, the hopeful, almost romantic scribblings of the first scientist to seriously investigate this place. Kulik, with his primitive tools and boundless optimism, had been certain he would find the meteorite. His journals spoke of a grand discovery just over the next ridge, a definitive answer waiting in the soil. Carter stared at the hopeful words of the dead man, and then back at his own monitor. displaying the endlessly scrolling, impeccably empty data logs from his GPR. The contrast was a mockery. "It can to be empty," Carter muttered to the silence, his voice hoarse. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "It's as the permafrost. There must be a layer of high-conductivity ferrous material that's scattering the signal before it can penetrate. Or a flaw in the GPRS firmware. A subtle miscalibration that only manifests in these specific sub-zero conditions." He clung to these rationalizations, these comfortable, solvable problems. They were life rafts in an ocean of inexplicable failure. The alternative that the theory itself, the bedrock of a century of scientific literature, was fundamentally wrong, was a chasm he refused to look into. He was a scientist. His job was to confirm the model, not tear it down. The days that followed blurred into a single, grueling loop of futility. The initial flicker of doubt hardened into a grim, grinding obsession. He pushed farther into the blast zone, dragging the GPR array over terrain that fought him at every step, the sled catching on the gnarled roots of fallen larch trees. His initial methodical grid search gave way to a frantic, sprawling pattern, a desperate casting of a net into an ocean that contained no fish. The weather turned, mirroring his internal state. The brilliant, clear skies of his arrival were replaced by an oppressive, bruised grey ceiling of cloud that pressed down on the landscape, making the ghost forest seem even more desolate. His world shrank to the hum of the GPR, the tasteless efficiency of freeze-dried rations, and the cold glow of his tablet. He grew gaunt, a dark stubble shadowing his jaw. The meticulous scientist was eroding, replaced by a haggard hermit haunted by a single, repeating image. The flat, mocking line on his screen. Every survey, every recalibration, every new power cell he swapped into the machine with numb fingers, ended with the same silent, damning verdict. Nothing. There was nothing there. The call came on the 5th day. A scheduled check-in. The face of Dr. Anna Pashin, his department head, materialized on his laptop screen. Her image crisp and clear in her pristine university office, a world away. His own image, broadcast from the tent, was grainy and buffered, his face gaunt in the low light. "Ben," she began, her tone lacking any preamble. "Your report is overdue, and the preliminary data you sent is blank." Carter struggled to find the words. "Anna, I am encountering unexpected geological conditions. The data is inconsistent with the impact model. There is no debris signature. None." Passion's expression didn't soften. It tightened. "Inconsistent? Ben, we were not talking about interpreting complex seismic data from the Mariana Trench. This is Tunguska. A 6-year-old with a metal detector could find fragments. The university has staked a significant amount of funding and prestige on this expedition." "Your expedition." "I understand that," Carter said, his frustration rising. "But the instruments are telling me. The instruments are telling you that you are failing to find what you were sent there to find." She cut in, her voice like ice. "Listen to me. The evidence is there, Ben. It has to be. You were sent to document it, not question it. Get it done." The connection chose that moment to sever. Her face dissolved into a block of pixels, replaced by a connection lost error. The silence that flooded the tent was heavier than before. He was alone, with an impossible result and an ultimatum. The institution, the very body of science he served, had no interest in a new discovery. It only wanted confirmation of an old one. Dusk settled over the taiga, painting the grey sky in shades of violet and blood orange. The temperature was dropping fast. Carter stood before his GPR console, the Machine S chassis cold to the touch. He had reached the end of his methodical rope. Reason had failed him. Repetition had failed him. The dogma of his superiors offered no solution, only condemnation. There was only one variable left to change. With a grim sense of finality, he began tapping on the console S interface. He navigated deep into the system S core controls, to a section locked behind stern, capitalized warnings. Maximum operational limits, the screen read. Bypassing safety protocols will void warranty and risks permanent system damage. He didn't hesitate. He dragged the slider for the radar S power output past the red line, from 100 to 200, then all the way to 300. An alarm icon flashed on the screen, which he dismissed. He did the same for the depth penetration, pushing the signal range far beyond its engineered capacity. The Machine S cooling fans, usually a gentle hum, spooled up into a high-pitched, straining whine. It was a reckless, desperate gamble, an act of violence against his own meticulous nature. He was no longer a scientist carefully observing a phenomenon. He was a brute, trying to force an answer from a world that refused to speak. It was an act of scientific faith, a prayer whispered to the unblinking eye of the machine, hoping that by sheer brute force, he could compel the truth to show itself. He hit enter and sent the piercing, overpowered signal deep into the frozen, silent earth below. For a long moment, the only sounds were the straining whine of the overloaded GPR unit and the frantic thumping of Ben Carter's own heart. He had pushed the machine to its breaking point, and now he could only watch as the consequences cascaded across his tablet screen. The clean, flat line of data dissolved into a blizzard of digital noise, a meaningless waterfall of static. His gamble had failed. He had broken his best piece of equipment in the middle of nowhere for nothing. He was about to shut it down when something impossible happened. A high-pitched alarm shrieked from the tablet, a piercing tone he'd never heard before. Through the storm of static, a single, coherent signal began to fight its way through. It was faint at first, a ghost in the machine, but it grew steadier with every passing second. It wasn't the chaotic signature of rock or ore. It was a line, a long, clean, mathematically perfect sweep of a curve, so flawless it could only be the product of intelligence. Carter froze. His breath hitched in his chest. The air, thin and cold, seemed to crystallize in his lungs. This was wrong. This was impossible. This shape did not belong in the geological vocabulary of the natural world. He slowly, hesitantly, reached out a trembling finger and traced the gentle, alien curve on the screen. His act of scientific faith had been answered, not with the data he wanted, but with a terrifying, beautiful, undeniable heresy. Back in the research tent, the world had shrunk to the space of a single folding table, where the GPR tablet sat like a sacred text. The storm of static had passed. The signal, amplified and clarified by hours of processing, now resolved into a breathtakingly clear image. It was the unmistakable outline of a colossal object, buried deep within the permafrost, its scale staggering. It was a vast, fusiform shape, a half-mile-long spear of manufactured material slumbering in the frozen earth. Carter sat before it, motionless, his face a pale mask of shock illuminated by the screener's sickly orange data glow. His eyes, wide with a dawning, terrifying awe, reflected the impossible shape. This was the moment, the instant his life, his career, his entire understanding of the universe fractured down the middle. One part of his mind, the scientist, was screaming. It was a sensor echo, a software bug, a trick of magnetic lensing from a deep iron deposit. It had to be. He threw himself into his work, his fingers flying across a secondary keyboard as he ran every diagnostic protocol in his arsenal. He programmed simulations to replicate the signal as a ghost image, an anomaly, a glitch. He tried, with all the formidable power of his rational mind, to debunk his own discovery. But the machine was relentless. Every diagnostic he ran came back negative. Every test he performed only served to confirm the object's solidity, its mass, its impossible presence. The data was not an error. The object was real. His experiment hadn't failed at all. It had succeeded, but it had proven a hypothesis he would never have dared to even consider. His mind, reeling from the confirmation, shifted from denial to a new frantic purpose. If the object was real, then what was its connection to the 1908 event? He fed the GPR data into his mapping software, generating a detailed three-dimensional model of the buried craft. The alien shape hung suspended in the digital space of his monitor. Then, he overlaid the historical maps of the blast radius, the great, flattened butterfly of dead trees. He zoomed in, aligning the datasets, and then he saw it. His blood ran cold. The established science, the story he had told the pilot with such certainty, was that the meteor had detonated miles up and miles away, with the shockwave traveling to create the epicenter. But that wasn't what the map showed. The center of the blast, the ground zero of the entire incomprehensible event, was not adjacent to the object. It wasn't a near miss. It was centered directly, precisely, mathematically perfectly, above the structure, buried in the ice. A whisper escaped his lips, barely audible in the silent tent. It wasn't an impact. It was a detonation. It came from the ground up. He needed physical proof. The data was one thing, but he needed something he could hold, something he could test. The next morning, under a sky the color of lead, he hauled his automated geological drill to the location he had marked, with a red flag, the point on the surface, directly above the buried anomaly. The drill's tungsten carbide bit whined as it chewed through the frozen soil and into the ancient permafrost, a material as hard as rock. The process was agonizingly slow. Hours passed. Finally, the drill retracted, pulling with it a long, perfect core of ice and rock. He rushed it back to the tent, to the small mobile lab he had set up. He prepared a slide and placed a sliver of the core sample under his digital microscope. He expected to see layers of ice, rock, and trapped sediment, but he saw something else. Embedded in the ice, like insects in amber, were microscopic, metallic filaments. They were impossibly thin, arranged in a complex woven lattice that no natural crystallization process could create. They were fragments of a technology beyond human conception. His hands shaking, he took another piece of the core and placed it beside his most sensitive instrument, a Geiger counter he had modified to detect a wide spectrum of radiation, far beyond the standard alpha, beta, and gamma. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came a single, soft, deliberate click. A pause, click. It wasn't the frantic chatter of a known radioactive source. It was a slow, rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat, a form of energy he didn't recognize, leaking from an alloy he couldn't identify, from a technology he couldn't comprehend. It was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. It was alien, and it was still active. The slow, rhythmic clicking of the modified Geiger counter was the only sound in the tent, a chillingly calm heartbeat counting down to an unknown apocalypse. Each click was a confirmation, a nail in the coffin of Ben Carter's orderly, predictable universe. The object below him wasn't just a dead relic. It was a wound in the world, and it was weeping a poison he could not name. He stared at the vial containing the core sample, at the microscopic metallic filaments suspended within. He had his proof, and as dusk began to bleed across the Siberian sky, his proof began to fight back. It started with the wind. A low moan at first, then a sharp, sudden gale that clawed at the fabric of his geodesic dome. Carter looked up from his instruments, frowning. The forecast had been clear for the next 48 hours, but when he peered outside, he saw a horrifying spectacle. The horizon was not darkening with the grace of a natural sunset. It was being devoured by a wall of bruised, boiling cloud that surged towards him with unnatural speed. He scrambled to secure the tense storm flaps, the wind tearing at him, biting with a savage, intelligent cold. Back inside, the lights began to flicker. One by one, his monitors, his data arrays, his entire suite of advanced technology sputtered and died. A high-pitched squeal erupted from his power converter before it too went silent, plunging the tent into a dim, terrifying twilight. An immense electromagnetic pulse centered on the buried craft had just surgically severed his connection to the 21st century. He was alone. The mystery he had come to study was now studying him, and its passive observation had just escalated into active hostility. The storm broke with the fury of a biblical plague. Snow, driven sideways by hurricane-force winds, battered the tent. The temperature plummeted. Carter, working by the frantic dancing light of a single emergency lantern, was no longer just a geologist. He was a castaway on a frozen island, besieged by a force he had awakened. His scientific curiosity had been replaced by a primal, gnawing fear, but even fear could not extinguish the core of who he was. He was a scientist, and he needed to understand the nature of the thing that was trying to kill him. He hunched over his last remaining piece of powered equipment, a rugged, battery-operated tablet displaying the data from the core sample. The rhythmic click of the handheld Geiger counter was faster now, more insistent. He frantically reviewed the energy signature readings, his mind racing, connecting variables, forming a terrible, logical conclusion. The object's energy was unstable, decaying. For over a century, the deep, ancient permafrost had acted as a perfect containment shield, absorbing the slow leak, locking it away in ice. But the shield was failing. Decades of rising global temperatures, the folly of a world away, had thinned the ice. The permafrost was melting, the energy was escaping, and the rate of the leak was accelerating exponentially. He looked from the tablet to the vibrating walls of his tent, listening to the impossible rage of the storm. It all clicked into place. This wasn't a natural blizzard. It was a direct atmospheric manifestation of the leak. The raw, alien energy pouring into the environment was warping the weather, creating a localized, contained storm of impossible intensity. The clicks of his Geiger counter were a ticking clock, and the storm outside was the sound of the world ending, 1 square kilometer at a time. He had to warn someone. He fumbled for his emergency satellite phone, a brick-like device designed to work when all else failed. He powered it on, his heart leaping as the small screen flickered to life, showing a single tenuous bar of signal. He dialed the only number he could, the direct line to Dr. Pashin. The phone rang, each tone an eternity. Then, a voice, broken and mangled by static. "Pashin Anna, it is Carter. You have to listen to me," he yelled over the roar of the wind. "The theory is wrong. It's a craft and energy source. It is failing. It is leaking. The storm, it's not natural." Her voice crackled back, each word a distorted fragment. "Ben? Your signal breaking up. Are you compromised?" "No. Yes, the object is real, Anna. The Tunguska Event was a detonation. I have proof. You have to Delirium, the static hissed. Frostbite, psychological symptoms. Ben, abort the mission. We will retrieve. The line went dead. He stared at the call-failed message on the screen. He had screamed the most important truth in human history into the void, and the voice of reason had diagnosed him with a fever. He was no longer Dr. Ben Carter, geologist. He was a mad prophet, a Cassandra howling in the wilderness. The world would not believe him. He was utterly, completely alone with the terrible, clicking truth, trapped in a tent with a dying alien god buried beneath his feet. Dawn broke, not with light, but with a change in the silence. The blizzard had passed as unnaturally as it had arrived, leaving behind a world smothered in deep, soundless snow. But the quiet was a fraud. Beneath it, a new sound was growing, a low subsonic hum that vibrated up through the soles of Carter's boots, a resonant thrum that felt as if the very bones of the earth were groaning in their sockets. The ground trembled, a steady, rhythmic shudder. The dying alien god below was stirring for the last time. There was no time for science, no time for analysis. There was only survival. Carter moved with frantic, desperate energy, throwing open his equipment cases, the spectrometer, the atmospheric sensors, the advanced comms array, millions of dollars in technology. The sum of his entire scientific life, he ignored it all. He grabbed a single empty go bag and packed it with the only two things that now mattered. The small, insulated vial containing the precious, impossible core sample, and the hardened data drives that held the proof of its origin. He zipped the bag shut, casting one last look at the research camp he had built with such meticulous pride. It was a tombstone now. He had come here a scientist. He would leave as a survivor, a refugee from a truth the world wasn't ready for. He threw his leg over the snowmobile and gunned the engine, tearing away from the camp and into the ghost forest. He didn't look back, but he could feel the hum intensifying behind him, the vibrations growing stronger. Then the world behind him split open. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw it. The ground was cracking apart, not in jagged, natural lines, but in a vast geometric pattern that traced the half-mile outline of the buried craft. From these fissures, there was no fire, no smoke. Instead, brilliant, silent columns of blue-white energy erupted into the morning sky. It was a beautiful, terrifying spectacle. A cathedral of light built in the heart of the wilderness. Waves of intense, absolute cold pulsed outwards from the fissures. The ancient larch trees in their path flash froze, their moisture crystallizing in an instant. They stood for a second as perfect sculptures of ice, and then, with a sound like shattering glass, they disintegrated into millions of glittering fragments. The pilot, Yuri's grandfather, had called it a cold fire. He was right. Carter was witnessing the death of a technology so advanced, so alien, that it was functionally indistinguishable from the most primal magic. Through the trees, he saw it. A miracle. The rugged, familiar shape of the Mi-8 helicopter, descending toward the pre-arranged extraction point. Yuri had come back. Carter hadn't known if the garbled, panicked fragments of his call had even been understood, but they had been heard. For Yuri, the frantic scientific warning of a leaking energy source had merged with the stories his grandfather had told him, the inherited folklore of a sky that split open. He was a man caught between two worlds and had chosen to believe them both. His face, etched with a profound fear as he saw the unholy light show on the horizon, was the face of a man whose superstitions had just been validated by a terrifying reality. Carter's snowmobile burst from the tree line, a tiny, desperate machine racing towards the promise of salvation. He scrambled aboard, screaming at Yuri to go, to get them in the air. The helicopter lifted off, its rotors fighting against the strange, energy-laden atmosphere. Just as they cleared the treetops, it happened. A final cataclysmic event. A massive dome of pure, silent, white light erupted from the ground where his camp had been. It expanded outwards with impossible speed, consuming everything. There was no sound, only the overwhelming, absolute presence of the light. Then came the shockwave. It slammed into the helicopter like a physical fist, tossing the aircraft through the sky like a leaf in a storm. Alarms screamed in the cockpit as Carter and Yuri fought the controls, wrestling their machine back from the brink. Below, where the light had been, there was now a new feature on the Siberian map. A massive, smouldering crater, its surface melted into a smooth, black, glassy scar. The craft was gone. The evidence was gone. All except for the small, heavy bag clutched in Carter's hands. The helicopter stabilized, banking away from the devastation. The air grew still. The unnatural hum was gone. Yuri, his face pale and beaded with sweat, let go of the controls with one hand and slowly, deliberately crossed himself. Carter said nothing. He stared out the window, his knuckles white as he clutched the data drive case to his chest, as if it were a holy relic. He did not look like a man who had solved one of history's greatest mysteries. He looked haunted. He had the data. He had the proof. But as he flew away from the pristine, glassy wound in the world, he knew that the truth he carried would be a far heavier burden than the mystery had ever been. He had sought a simple, rational answer, and in finding it, had become the unwilling prophet for a new and terrifying age. What's more powerful, a scientific fact or a good story? Our journey with Dr. Carter begins with that classic conflict. On one side, we have the neat, tidy explanation of a meteor airburst. It's rational, it makes sense, it fits our models. On the other, we have the pilot's folklore, a poetic, terrifying vision of a second sun and a cold fire that burned the sky. But the narrative we just experienced does something fascinating. It doesn't just have science debunk the folklore. It forces science to uncover a truth that is far stranger, more mythic than the original story. Dr. Carter's instruments don't just solve the mystery, they deepen it, replacing a simple rock with an ancient, dying intelligence. His journey shows how the line between a provable fact and an unbelievable story can become incredibly thin. In the end, his boss, the voice of established science, rejects the data precisely because it sounds too much like a myth. But the pilot, Yuri, returns because Carter's unbelievable scientific warning finally makes sense of his grandfather's old tale. It took both data and folklore to grasp the full truth. This leaves us with a really interesting dilemma. So, here is the question I want to leave with you. If you were presented with undeniable scientific proof of something that completely shattered your understanding of reality, how would you react? Would you trust the evidence, no matter how unbelievable? Or would you hold on to a more comforting, familiar world?